Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My very special guest today is literary rock star Neil Gaiman. Thank you for being here, Neil.
Thank you for having me.
I don't use the term literary rock star lightly. What is it like to have the platform you have? You have nearly 1 million followers on Twitter. And I'm speaking as a starving artist. You know, I have maybe 90 followers. So what is it like?
I don't know what it's not like to have. I mean, when I started on Twitter, I had 10 followers, and then now I've got 2.2 million, and it's odd. It's a huge responsibility. Mostly.
That's what I was going to ask you.
You learn relatively quickly. One, you can't be angry, snotty, or rude, because you are broadcasting hate and anger to 2.2 million people, and there may be somebody out there who's going to. You could too easily edge into, will someone rid me of this turbulent priest? You know, that point where somebody goes, oh, Neil is angry with AT&T. I will do something to win his pleasure by blowing up AT&T or something. And you don't want that kind of nonsense to happen. But it's actually, mostly it's rather wonderful. It's a strange responsibility when it comes to linking to things, because it's much too easy to crash a website. I'm doing my best to use these powers for good. I've been doing a lot of work recently with UNHCR, the United Nations Refugee Organization, and pushing attention and eyeballs their way. That sounds disgusting. I just meant people who look, not actual eyeballs. You do the best you can with it, and also the other thing you do is you don't take it seriously. You remember the glorious thing about being a writer, as opposed to being a rock star, is that what you actually do, the thing everybody cares about, the thing that makes the magic happen, is you sit in a room on your own and you glare at a screen, or you squint angrily at a piece of paper, and you cross things out, and that's all time spent alone, and that's important. And at that point, you are naked, unimportant, and it's just you and the words. It's lovely to be able to turn up and have, what have we got tonight, 2,300 people turning up, which I tend to attribute as much to the fact that lots of authors don't come to Tulsa. Actually, as much as I do to being a rock star. It was one of those things where I started thinking, it's so strange, because I've been doing American author tours for 30 years now, and I've never come to Oklahoma.
Well, getting you here was on my bucket list.
I'm glad it worked.
Oh, I'm so glad too.
It's nice to be in your bucket.
You've described yourself as a feral child who grew up in libraries. Why libraries?
They were safe spaces, and they were safe spaces that had books in. And books for me were always the best kind of escape, the best kind of places to go. For me, a book was always a place, if it was any good. And books you liked were places you went back to. So something like the Narnia books, or The Hobbit, or Mary Poppins, these were things I could always go back to. I could always pick up that book and open the cover, and I would be in that place. And I think I was very lucky. I had, whether by accident or design, really well-curated libraries. My local small-town library was incredibly well-curated. It had strange things in it that now I have to pay ridiculous amounts of money to secondhand book dealers to try and find copies of books that I loved when I was 12, because there's only one copy out there, and it turns out to have been tiny and rare and unusual, but they had it in my local library. By the same token, my favorite school library, which was when I was age 9 through to about 13, was a school library where I could tell when they'd had money to buy books, because they had a really good Edwardian selection, and then nothing for a while, and then a little bunch of books bought in the late 1920s, and then nothing for a while, and nothing through the war, and then just after the war, they obviously had money again to buy books, and there were a lot of books bought in the 1950s, and then nothing much in the 60s. So I wound up, without knowing it, with a remarkable specialist education in Edwardian literature, which is the kind of thing you only discover when you're in your mid-20s and people are talking about strange and obscure books. And you go, yeah, I've read that. They say, how could you have read that? I say, well, it was in my school library. Of course I read it.
What's the first book you remember reading that was transformative for you?
What a great question. In terms of real transformation, not being the same person after reading that book that you were before reading the book, it may well actually, in terms of sequence, is really hard. I think it was probably Mary Poppins by P.L. Travers. And what I loved about Mary Poppins was that I didn't understand the nature of Mary Poppins, and that she was not something that you were capable of understanding. You were not given enough information. What she was obviously not actually a god, but she was definitely not human. She was a person, but she was a person who consorted with stars and spoke in the languages of the animals and the babies, and could talk to a sunbeam, and was still herself. And all of this was something which at the age of 6, I remember just trying to understand. So that was a hugely transformative book. C.S. Lewis, less The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but the Voyage of the Dawn Treader was transformative. I remember just reading that, and the world was more magical after I'd read it. I wanted to find my way to Narnia. I knew that if I went to the right place, then stars would be people. And if I'm going to give you a third transformative book, because why not? I would have been 9 or 10, and I read a book called SF-12, edited by Judith Merrill. And it had started off, I think, as a best science fiction of the year or whatever, but by the time it got up to 12, it was just called SF. And in it, she made a big play of the fact that SF could stand for anything, including speculative fiction, and so on and so forth. And it was a wonderful book for a 10-year-old to read, again, because there was so much I didn't understand. There were stories in it by Brian Aldiss, by William Burroughs. There was a story in there called They Do Not Always Remember. Kit Reeves, Samuel R. Delany, a novella called The Star Pit, ended it. There were short poems by Tuli Kupferberg of the band The Fugs, these odd, tiny little poems that made a huge impression on me. And there were actually not one, but 2 stories by R.A. Lafferty. And that was the first place I encountered Lafferty. A story called The Primary Education of the Cameroy, and one called Narrow Valley, which I think in many ways was one of his very great short stories. And it was an American tall tale rephrased into a kind of magical science fiction about a valley, a huge and beautiful valley with horses in it and so forth, that was the size of a ditch. And I remember reading that. And that anthology was again transformative. And it was transformative because I would read it and I knew I didn't quite understand it. And I knew I wasn't ready for it, but it was exciting and it was interesting. So I would go back to it. And every 6 months, every 8 months, every year, I'd pick up that book and I'd reread it and find something in a story that I hadn't understood before, or suddenly realize who these people were or why this worked.
What's your quick take on Ray Bradbury?
I loved Ray. I loved Ray as a person in later years. When I was a kid, I remember buying The Golden Apples of the Sun. I found a copy of The Silver Locusts, which was the English title of the Martian Chronicles, and read and loved that. I was less convinced by Dandelion Wine. I remember finding Dandelion Wine, while I loved the writing, it didn't help that I was about 12 years old, and the hero of Douglas Spalding, the Bradbury hero of Dandelion Wine, is 12 years old too. And he kept going on about how he needed these special running shoes, and then he would run forever, and the way that he talked and think, I'd look at it and go, you do not talk or think like any 12-year-old boy I have ever encountered, and I do not believe that in America they talk like you. You talk and think like a 30-year-old American writer with a very romantic view of the past, which I guess I was right in. But Ray was one of those authors without whom I would not be me. And one story of his, you were talking transformative.
Right.
There was a short story that he wrote called Homecoming, which I read when I was probably about 7, about a little boy being raised in a sort of Addams Family house. They're all vampires and monsters, and now it's a kind of Thanksgiving. From all over the world, the monsters are coming to this house, and this little kid, Timothy, is human and feels inadequate and wishes that he could fly and wishes he had white teeth and wishes he could have all the magic powers, and everybody there sort of loves him, but they also feel really sorry for him because they're not going to die, and he is. And I remember reading that story, and it was the first time I'd encountered somebody in fiction who felt like me. Timothy felt like me. And
That's huge.
And so that one moment, again, was enormous and transformative. And I understood that I wanted desperately to never be afraid of the dark. I wanted to feel like I was just like everybody else, and didn't understand at that point that nobody feels like they're just like everybody else. Everybody, we are all of us at whatever age, floating on our own little icebergs. But at that time, that was the perfect metaphor for my existence, and that was the story that touched me.
Stephen King.
Steve, I didn't discover until I was about 14, 15, and discovered him, I think, in some ways with The Perfect Book, which was not Carrie, which I read very soon after, but it was Salem's Lot. And the cover was fantastic, an embossed girl's face with one little drip of blood just there. And there was nothing on the back cover to tell you that this was a vampire book. And there weren't any vampire books at that time. I'd read Dracula and been kind of disappointed and loved the idea of a good book with vampires in, but hadn't been able to find one. It was 1973, 74, and vampires were not yet hip, trendy, cool, or everywhere. And I remember the joy, 60, 70 pages into Salem's Lot, of going, this could be a vampire book. That would be amazing. I just loved it. And I think Steve is a phenomenon. I'm completely amazed and impressed by the fact that he writes books always. The books do not stop. He writes fantastic books. Sometimes he writes books that aren't fantastic. And he's sort of the first one to admit when he'll write a book that isn't fantastic. But there's a point where you look around and you go, look, you've written whatever it is now by this point, 50, 60 novels. You're allowed some clunkers. You're allowed some stinkers. Because if you didn't write the way that you write, which is you sit there, you write the book, you publish it, you go on to the next one, you also wouldn't do the great and the glorious ones. Whatever is inside you that creates the books is the thing that means that you could write something like, I don't know, Cell, which is a novel about cell phones that turn everybody into zombies. It doesn't really even have an ending. I mean, it's one of those great books. It's a 1 out of 10 King book, but it's also that same engine that allows him to produce something like Misery, which is a 10 out of 10 book, or A Bag of Bones, which are great novels in anybody's, by whatever standards you judge a great novel. And the thing that I find weirdest about Steve, of course, is because he does that, what happens is about once every 7 years, with a certain amount of astonishment, the literary establishment rediscovers Steve. And you get these articles saying, Stephen King is a real writer. Stephen King is a great writer. He's just written this real book. And then, of course, he will tend to follow up that real book that everybody turns around and goes, wow, Steve is such a real writer, with something like Cell, where heads explode and stuff and worms get eaten, just to remind people that, yeah, he may be that, but actually he's also this, and he is not going to sit in your box.
Well, he's a huge fan of yours. He's said that your Sandman series elevated the graphic novel to an art form. Your thoughts?
He is a very, very sweet and generous man, and that is an astonishingly kind thing to say.
What is it about the graphic novel format that most appeals to you?
I think mostly, especially when I was starting out, it was that feeling, it was like being in Hollywood in 1918. Going, there's all this stuff that nobody's done before. Nobody's yet done a jump cut. Nobody's done a montage. There are things I can do that nobody's done. I can figure out how this works. And I think for me that was always the most exciting thing. These days, we're 30 years on from there. And the weirdest thing for me, I saw a documentary last night that was filmed. It was just a little half-hour short, filmed in 1987. And I watched it because it has me, age 26 in, and my friend Dave McKean, age 23, and we're talking about Violent Cases, our first book. We're very excited. And at the end, the reviewer, the person who's doing the documentary, does this little thing about talking to camera and saying, well, I imagine a strange future in which everybody reads graphic novels, and in which graphic novels can be bought in regular bookshops, and all of this kind of, in which graphic novels win literary awards. And it has this sort of faintly snickery quality, that it's said as if he's trying to read it as if he's a comics character, and there's sort of little drawings of what it might be like in this strange world in which people are now reading graphic novels all the time. And I thought, hang on, we got there about 10 years ago, actually, maybe a little bit more. I mean, it wasn't long after this documentary got made that Mouse won the Pulitzer. By the time we got to a few years ago when the New York Times actually decided to create the graphic novel bestseller list, because graphic novels, it was embarrassing and awkward when somebody like Robert Crumb would bring out his retelling of the Book of Genesis as a graphic novel to have it go to the #1 spot on the New York Times list. So they went, well, we will avoid these strange awkwardnesses. And the graphic novels went off and now have their own list in the New York Times. I thought we actually are in that future. And that makes me very happy.
Your latest adult novel is The Ocean at the End of the Lane. How would you describe this book to people who haven't read it yet?
It's very short. It's quite a short novel. It was accidental, I would tell them that. It's a novel, it's an adult novel in which for most of the book the protagonist is a 7-year-old. It's not a kid's book, despite the fact that the protagonist is 7, and there is strange magical stuff in it. and there's all sorts of peculiar things that might be science fiction and might be fantasy, including a strange monster who may or may not turn up in the form of his nanny. But for all of that, it is peculiarly a book for adults.
The book's dedicated to your wife, Amanda Palmer. Why is that creative kinship so important to you as a writer? For a bunch of very odd reasons, I think. The oddest of which is it is wonderful to be in a relationship with somebody who understands what you do, who is herself a creator of things, who isn't jealous of time that I spend writing, who isn't jealous of time that I spend with fans, who completely understands that I will go out and talk to 2,500 people and then come home, and that's part of what I do. That whole creative thing for me is very important, in the same way that I completely understand if it's 2 a.m. and she suddenly has an idea for a song and disappears off to the piano all night and reappears at 11 o'clock in the morning looking rather bleary, having not slept, but having produced a song in the meantime. You say in the dedication very simply that she wanted to know.
Yeah. The book, as I say, it was accidental. Amanda had gone to Melbourne, Australia to make a record. She was going to record her album there, which meant she was going to be gone for the best part of about 3 months. I, at the time, was in Florida. I thought, good, she'll go off to Australia, I'll go to Florida and I'll get some writing done. And I missed her. And I missed her a lot. And she was very busy, so she did not miss me.
Yeah.
Because if somebody's actually making an album, you go, hello, I miss you. And it would be like, yes, that's fine. Thank you. I'm going back to my work now. And I thought, I need to do something that is more bigger and lovelier than sending her flowers. I know, I will write her a short story. So I started writing her a short story, and I thought I will put things in it that she likes. She likes me, and she wants to know about my childhood. I'll put that in there. She likes emotions. I normally don't do emotions terribly well, being male and English, but I will put emotions into this. I'll put things in that she likes, and I will give her the story when it's done in a week or two, as if I were giving her some flowers.
That's lovely.
But it wasn't done in a week or two, and then it wasn't done in a month, and then about 2.5, 3 months later, I looked up, and she'd come back from Australia, and I was just finishing this thing, and I went off to Dallas, where she was mixing the album, and I finished typing up the second draft, and I did a word count, and discovered that I'd accidentally written a novel.
So it really was an accident.
It really was an accident.
See, I thought you were,
No, it really was an accident. I normally know when I'm writing a novel. I tell everybody. I make a big deal out of it. It's like, leave me alone, everybody. I'm writing a novel. This was just, I'm writing a short story, but it's going a bit long.
Explain the concept behind your latest book, Trigger Warnings, which is a collection of short fiction.
The idea, well, the biggest idea, honestly, was it is 8 years since I published a short story collection. In that 8 years, I've written a lot of short fiction. Let's put it all together. So that was the giant impetus. It's my 3rd short story collection now. The first was called Smoke and Mirrors, Short Fictions and Delusions. And then I did Fragile Things, Short Fictions and Wonders. And I got up to Trigger Warning. I thought I'll call it Trigger Warning, Short Fictions and Disturbances. And the title came from something that was fascinating me at the time that I wrote it, which was, for a while now, particularly in an online context, there have been what are called trigger warnings. If there is something that contains content that could send you into a deep, dark, black funk, you are warned of it on the web. Things like rape or abuse, things like that, murder, suicide, trigger warning. But over the last year, there have been moves to try and persuade universities to put trigger warnings on all of their content. And I found myself going, I don't like that. I don't like that idea. I don't like the idea that Hamlet would get a trigger warning for madness and suicide and murder. I don't know that you should be given specific warnings as to specific content. And I don't really know that I approve of putting trigger warnings on fiction in a university context. A university, a campus or at least a course room is not the right place to treat post-traumatic stress disorder. And furthermore, there is an idea that as a college student, you are an adult and you are going into these things. When I did Sandman, we would always have a warning that just sort of said mature readers, for mature readers only. So that was the idea behind it, really.
Thank you so much for being here, Neil, and thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.